Social Justice Paladin, episode 26, Politics, part 3, Years of Apathy. The next several years were difficult for our family, so I didn't pay much attention to politics. We wound up living in Branson, Missouri for a few years, and that community is uber patriotic. All the glamour of Las Vegas, but family oriented. Our next president was Barack Obama from 2008 to 2016. Sorry to say, the best opposition the Republicans could muster up was Mitt Romney, so I was mostly apathetic for that election. You need to understand that there is not a racist bone in my body. 20 years of military life had beaten it out of me, regardless of what proponents of critical race theory want to believe. But overall, I have a hard time voting for somebody simply based on their skin color. One thing I've noticed, and largely disagreed with, is this current theology of putting someone in a position of leadership based solely on their diversity, equity, and inclusion score, rather than the simple idea that they were qualified for the job. For example, Joe Biden recently bragged that over 50% of the females in his cabinet were women.
More than half the women in my cabinet, more than half the people in my cabinet, more than half of the women in my administration are women.
I know that some people may think this is a mental flub or perhaps one of his stutters, but in the current cultural climate, he may just be right. It was also said recently that President Biden has the most diverse cabinet ever, quote, and there will be other notable firsts. In addition to the barrier-breaking Vice President Kamala Harris, there will be America's first female Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, its first openly gay Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, for the Department of Transportation, and its first Native American Secretary, Deb Haaland, for the Department of the Interior, the first woman to serve as Director of the National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and the first immigrant to lead the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, to name just a few. New York Times, January 21st, 2021. Well, that's great and all, but did anybody stop long enough to ask if these purely political appointments were even qualified for the jobs? Or is that now just a secondary consideration? What if you were going under the knife for a surgery only to find out that the, quote, surgeon only had a GED? I know I might be mixing apples and oranges, but you get my point. Most, if not all, of this penchant for, quote, diversity hiring had its beginnings with Barack Hussein Obama. Feel free to change my view. Another interesting thing I remember during the Obama administration was the near Messiah worship. Lots of people were asking me at the time, do you think BHO is the Antichrist? My answer was a flat, unequivocal no. Well, why not? After years of studying end-time prophecy, he just didn't impress me that much. Sure, there were people putting him on a pretty tall pedestal, but I couldn't picture him as a global leader of the New World Order. He had the pride, but not the slick. But hold on to that thought for later. And then along came Donald Trump, the man everybody loves to hate. I remember my mom calling me, begging me, please, please promise me you're not going to vote for Trump. Funny, I don't ever remember calling her, begging her not to vote for Clinton. Again, not that President Trump was the more qualified. Hillary had been in and around government since Bill's time in office. But to me, his inexperience was almost a selling point. At this point in America's story, it seemed like career politicians had ruined the America that I remembered. It seemed time to turn the reins over to a qualified outsider, a businessman with connections. I know a lot of people were upset with his locker room talk. They said that he, quote, objectified women. Weren't these the same people who were defending Bill Clinton during his impeachment trial? And didn't Bill Clinton do, like in the Oval Office, mind you, what Donald J. Trump only talked about, and before he was even elected? Apparently, unlike Doc Holliday, the hypocrisy knows no bounds. Another criticism I had to answer for was, I thought you were a Christian. How can you even think about voting for a slimy snake like Trump? It's a good question, but I'm not under any illusions about President Trump's morality. But far from Hillary, President Trump at least leaned in the direction of protecting a Christian's freedom of religion versus Mrs. Clinton's freedom from religion. Because of our current political system, you really only have the choice between two candidates. It's generally acknowledged that voting for the third-party candidate, when they're polling at less than 5%, is essentially throwing away your vote, but more on that later. So, given the choice between Hillary Clinton, I mean, nobody ever proved that she had over 50 people suicided. And Don the Snake Trump, I think I'll still go with the snake. Which would you rather have leading the country? A narcissistic sociopath or a homicidal sociopath? Not much to choose from. But in the end, President Trump was, and still is, firm about being, quote, pro-America, while Hillary was clear about calling half the country, of which I was a part, or solidly leaning, a basket of deplorables. And before you can say it was just a, quote, misstatement, I know she repeated her statement several times on the campaign trail. After being a 20-year patriot, I didn't take too kindly to being called deplorable. In my defense, I actually voted for Ted Cruz in the primaries. Personally, I did think Ted would have made a better qualified candidate overall, but he would have gotten the same ill treatment that 45 did, but never really got the opportunity. Oh, that's okay. It leaves Ted open for a seat on the Supreme Court, provided we get another right-leaning president, something I'm somewhat pessimistic about. But circling back on the whole biblical Antichrist being slick, I'm not saying Trump is the Antichrist, but he is a way better candidate for the position than Obama ever was. Just saying. Then with the election of Joseph R. Biden in 2020, I'm on the verge of losing hope in our election system. Never before has there been such sleight of hand, deception, chicanery, double dealing, smoke and mirrors regarding our voting process at multiple levels of government. Vote tallies changing overnight, taking days or even weeks to count up the votes, multiple people refusing to concede the results, boxes of votes showing up at the last minute, stacks of votes that were at least appeared to be Xerox, and multiple election officials being prosecuted for fraud. It doesn't exactly lend itself to increasing one's faith in the system. And it does seem that there are more than a few Republicans who are just as guilty as Democrats. Power corrupts, someone once said. Anytime someone publishes a list of elected Democrats that are rapists, murderers, sex traffickers, and pedophiles, there's usually an equally long list of Republicans. Let's not kid ourselves. I guess the tipping point for me was the latest midterm elections. First up is John Fetterman versus Mehmet Oz in the Pennsylvania Senate race. Oz was a doctor, had name recognition from his time on Oprah, and had a decent centrist platform. Fetterman had a stroke and a bad showing on debate night, but apparently he impressed enough voters to swing the election. Now, after winning the election and simply placeholding his 51st Senate seat, he's out for over a month now for, quote, depression. Then there's Kari Lake, a retired news anchor, versus Katie Hobbs. Hobbs is the current Secretary of State for Arizona who, oddly enough, is in charge of the state election results. FYI, to keep the appearance of honesty, she should have recused herself. But she didn't, and proclaimed that the election was fair and that she herself had won. The case is now, as of this recording months later, gone to the Maricopa County Superior Court, Arizona Court of Appeals. Personally, based on other states' track records, I don't hold out much hope for Lake, but I like her fire. After all this, I've come to the conclusion that the Democrats have engineered a nearly foolproof system for rigging state, local, and potentially national elections, aided, of course, with the compliance of the mainstream media, with help from Republican rhinos rolling over just to show their bellies should there be any disputes. In short, get used to a one-party system and a Democrat majority for the foreseeable future. So, with the 2022 midterms behind us mostly, President Trump has recently announced his bid for 2024, along with Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, and Nikki Haley, the one-time UN ambassador. Joe Biden is saying he'll run again, but he is slipping cognitively, and he will be about 82, with some speculation about whether or not he chooses Kamala Harris as his running mate. Next up, episode 27, Politics, Part 4, To Infinity and Beyond.